Hello, I'm Jose, and I will be doing this week's question number 3, which states, what did you learn about Plato's argument against democracy? Do you find his perspective compelling? Why or why not? Pardon me. Do you think some of these vices are present in the United States? To start off, I want to lay out Plato's argument against democracy. And it begins when he talks about the cupbearers of this feast, which would be the government, having drunk too much of that sweet wine, which is freedom, and now they are, by definition, drunk on this ideal of freedom. And what ends up happening with these citizens is Plato says that the structures and different levels of respect that sort of guide the society begin to break down, they decompose. He says that the the levels between the son and the father break as the father grows to ascend or to descend to the level of his son. And it goes further into saying that masters fear and falter their scholars, and scholars despise their masters and tutors, young and old are all alike. And it goes down what some would say a slippery slope of saying that this infests even the animals of the house. However, it's just a point he's trying to make, that it becomes so resonant within the society that everyone, including the animals per se, would feel this sense of freedom, and there is no more order, there is no more structure. And so what ends up happening is his second point is that people get this chafing towards freedom, and oh, sorry, towards authority because of their freedom, because they are accustomed and drunk with this ideal that everything is free and equal, and so everyone's opinions and beliefs are just as valid as everyone else's, their own included. Then there is no reason to respect anyone else's beliefs and views. And so there's this chafing, this sort of resistance against authority. And that's what Plato argues, is that democracy leads to a drunkenness of the citizens with freedom. This freedom then leads to a sense of chafing against authority, and these structures of respect get broken down to the point where there's no distinction between masters and slaves, between professors and students per se. And what what is compelling to me about this argument, that I find compelling, is that I see it, and it's pretty prevalent in our society now. One of the examples that we were shown in class about the incident that happened at Target is a great example. And there are other many examples that were also mentioned, like the anti-maskers, whose regard for the public is based on their own opinion, where they have this figmentation that because they are free and no one can impose an opinion on them, they believe that the way that they act based on their beliefs is okay. And they disregard anyone else's say, even if they are more educated or have more experience or come from a place of reason. And this is what Plato warns would happen, and more so that there's this chafing too, that when someone tries to impose authority, to say this is what should be done, this is what has to be done, there's a resistance. And in the Target one, we saw that the man who was told not to park in the handicap spot, even though he was in the wrong, he felt the chafing. He pushed the man in the wheelchair who asked him to move, which is by all regards a travesty, right? It's some depletion of humanity and society, and it's horrible, right? These structures of respect are broken, and that's what Plato warns against. And I see it too in smaller microscopic ways, per se. For example, one of my classrooms, I've I love this professor. She's great, and she's very democratic. So she allows the chat to be a place where people can post conversations throughout the entire lecture. And while this is a great tool, as democracy is as well, it can advertently lead to people taking advantage of it. And this is what happens. People have conversations, full conversations that have nothing to do with what's at hand, and they ignore the professor, and it creates distraction for their students. And it's based on this idea, right, that their conversations and whatever it is that it has to be said at that moment is so important, and I guess more important than that of the professor's regard. And it's because of this idea, right, that every opinion is equal and valid, and that there is a sense of equality amongst our thoughts. But uh, you know, included in this, I feel sort of need to speak up about the chat. However, I fear that there will be a sort of chafing, right? That if I do acknowledge what is going on, and I do say, hey, we should pay attention, there will be backlash. There will be a sort of resistance to the imposed structures of respect that we should be upholding, right? And that's that's why I find uh, Plato's argument against democracy compelling. That's not to say, however, that democracy does not have its virtues, as we did see in Pericles' um, his I'm so sorry his funeral oration. There are a lot of benefits to democracy. There is the the sort of self citizen compelling himself to be a certain temperament because of the institution in which he lives in. Pericles says that people are respectful to each other and do not wish harm on one another, and that positions of power in government are granted to those based on a meritocracy because they have earned it, not because they want it necessarily, right? And that's the virtue of democracy. But at the same time, there are dangers, right? And that's what's compelling to me. It's not to say, though, that democracy is a bad thing. To me, it's about compromises, and that's something that we're going to see too in this coming chapter, chapter 2, which is very interesting. It talks about these compromises that have to be made in a democracy.